thirsty for young blood.
Hello survivors and welcome to Survivor's Guilt, the only channel that determines your odds of surviving 1981's slasher-sprouting sequel, Friday the 13th Part 2, so stay tuned till the end for your survival stats. I'm your sharp-dressed slasher turned Oedipus complex, GhostFake. Before we begin, go ahead and hit that like button like it had spent years crying about a death curse, and stab that subscribe button with an ice pick like it survived the first movie and killed your mom. And go ahead and hit that share button to warn everyone that this camp has a death curse! Now I hope you like severed heads that were left on the counter for too long, because this movie is getting spoiled. Friday the 13th Part 2, written by Ron Kurz and Victor Miller, and directed by Steve Miner, starring Amy Steele, John Furey, Kirsten Baker, Stuart Charno, and Warrington Gillette. Friday the 13th Part 2 is about the revenge of Jason Voorhees against counselors that attempt to open a death-cursed counselor camp. We open up to a couple of months after the events of the first film, at Alice's apartment as she nightmares her way through the events of the first film. She finally wakes up and begins her day in the dead of night, talking on the phone, taking a shower, talking on the phone some more, and eventually getting a cat chucked at her. You know, the usual. She decides to go ahead and feed the cat, but when she opens up her fridge, she realizes that the severed head is spoiled. But Jason, who's planning on having sex with that severed head later, spoiled or not, tells Alice that there's no sense crying over spoiled head with an ice pick into hers, tying up loose ends at deposit number 1, or 12 into the meat bank. Cut to 5 years later, we get introduced to Sandra and Jeff, who are trying to find their way to Crystal Lake when they get approached by Crazy Ralph, who can't wait a damned minute.
I told the others. They didn't believe me.
They're on the phone.
You're all doomed.
A little later, we get introduced to Ted, a friend of theirs who likes to pull pranks, and eventually Paul when we get over to the Counselor Training Center on Crystal Lake, where Paul introduces us to our main characters. We've got Terry and Vicky, Scott and Mark.
Okay, the rest of you, I'm sure I'll get to know soon enough.
No you won't, Paul. And a short time later, we get introduced to Ginny, Paul's assistant, / aspiring child psychologist, / all-around final girl, who is late because her car is not working properly. Later that night, Paul scares the counselors by telling them a story about Jason, implying that he didn't drown but actually survived living off the land, and now he hunts these grounds. Before clearing up that that's all a bunch of bullshark.
Jason drowned, Mrs. Voorhees was killed, and Camp Crystal Lake is off limits.
Later that night, while Sandra tries to convince Jeff to take her to see Camp Blood, Crazy Ralph lurks around trying to catch a peep on someone he can warn about the death curse. But before he can flex his voyeurism, Jason throws a wire around his neck and harbingers Ralph right into the meat bank at deposit number 2, or 13. The next day, Sandra approaches Jeff, asking if he's ready to go check out Camp Blood.
You ready?
For what?
Camp Blood.
And they set off to investigate the camp that has a death curse. But during their trespassing jaunt, they get stopped by Officer Winslow, who takes them back to the Counselor Training Center and turns them into Paul, warning him to keep his campers away from there. And Paul lays down a stiff punishment on them for trespassing.
Ginny, no seconds on dessert for Jeff and Sandra tonight.
Later that evening, Officer Winslow sees someone sneaking into the woods and gives chase. He chases the figure through the trees, eventually arriving at a pieced-together homestead in the woods. He goes inside and looks around, eventually finding a room where something catches his interest long enough to end up on the receiving end of the claw end of a hammer, nailing Officer Winslow into the meat bank at deposit number 3, or 14. Back at the Counselor Training Center, Paul realizes that they don't have the budget to kill off all these extras, so he offers them one last night on the town before training begins, cutting our deposit significantly. The remaining group hang out in the bunk while Terry goes off to skinny dip, but when Terry exits the lake, she finds her clothes missing, and Scott taunts her with them and runs into the woods, eventually getting snagged up in a trap. Terry runs back to the camp to find something with which to cut him down, but before she returns, Jason shows up and cuts him down first, cutting Scott into the meat bank at deposit number 4, or 15. Terry returns only to find that Scott's already been cut down, forever, only for her to run straight into Jason, and off-screen into the meat bank at deposit number 5, or 16. Back at the bar, Ginny muses on the what-ifs if Jason was real, describing how one might describe a Jason Voorhees.
Some kind of out-of-control psychopath? Child trapped in a man's body?
And contemplating Jason's morals, or lack thereof, since he was young when he drowned, and probably witnessed his mother's death, and how he may or may not be coping. Back at the camp, Vicky flirts with Mark, asking about what put him in the wheelchair because she's concerned it's contagious.
Just your legs, huh? Is everything else okay?
While Sandra and Jeff head upstairs to see if what they have is contagious. Sexually. Vicky invites Mark over to her cabin before breaking Scream's third rule for surviving horror movies.
I'll be right back.
and she heads to her cabin to freshen up. But Mark is too eager to do the horizontal mambo, because the vertical one isn't an option, and leaves the cabin to find her, but instead finds a machete lodged into his skull, and then finds himself in the meat bank at deposit number 6, or 17. Meanwhile, Sandra and Jeff wrap up what they was doing. Never mind, they probably didn't. Just in time for a mystery intruder to arrive and make 2 deposits with 1 spear, efficienting Jeff and Sandra into the meat bank at deposits 7 and 8, or 18 and 19. Back at the bar, Ginny and Paul decide that it's time to head out, and they start making their way back to camp. While at the same time, Vicky arrives back at the cabin looking for Mark, but only finds old Baghead. Ugh, I hate it when that happens. Before she finds herself into the meat bank at deposit number 9, or 20. Ginny and Paul return to the training center only to find everyone missing, and the place covered with blood, but no bodies. But before they can properly panic, the power goes out, leaving Paul to look for the breaker box to shine a light on the situation. But as he fidgets with the breakers, old Baghead emerges from the shadows and attacks him. And when it becomes clear that Paul was no match for Baghead, Ginny decides it's a good time to run away. And after she escapes the cabin and plays a handful of games of cat and mouse, and a brief standoff in her own cabin, she eventually finds her way to Baghead's humble abode. And when she sees him approaching, she barricades herself in a room that turns out to be his weird sex altar, where he definitely bangs his mom's head. And while Baghead attempts to break into the room, joke's on him, it's his house, idiot. Ginny gets an idea to start putting on Pam's sweater, since it's not her size anymore. Ginny quickly makes herself look like Pam, just with more vitality and less rot. And when Jason breaks through his door, Ginny plays Pam and it works somehow.
Jason! It's all done, Jason.
Telling her son that he's all done, and it's time to stop killing.
Jason, Mother is talking to you!
But he gets suspicious when Ginny raises a machete, and even more suspicious when his eye catches his fleshlight on the table, and he uses his pickaxe to block Ginny's machete swing, knocking it from her hands. Just then, Paul arrives, only to make things much worse, and lose his second fight with Jason. Oh, that's pathetic. But he gives Ginny enough time to grab her machete and stick it in Jason's Achilles shoulder. And the two of them leave the shack before the smell overtakes them. They make their way back to their cabin, but quickly realize that they may still be in danger when they hear something at the door. It turns out to be a dog that they made us think was dead earlier in the movie, but that should definitely be dead now. And just after Ginny breathes a sigh of relief, Jason bursts through the window and yanks Ginny out of it. Cut to the next day, where the first responders are loading Ginny into the ambulance while she asks where Paul is.
Where's Paul?
Now, here's the problem. We never find out where Paul is, and he never reappears in the series, and his body is never found, leaving his fate totally ambiguous. But in part 3, a news report tells of 8 bodies strewn all around the lake.
8 corpses have been discovered in what has already been...
which accounts for all of the bodies except for Alice, since she was killed elsewhere. But it also mentions Ginny being the only survivor recovered.
Ginny Field miraculously survived.
So I'd say, given Paul's penchant for losing fights with Jason, as well as the fact that it seems more likely that they would not find a body as opposed to Paul bouncing in the middle of the night and disappearing off the face of the earth, I'm going to go ahead and count Paul as deposit number 10, or 21, into the meat bank. And that's canon. They load Ginny into the wagon and drive off, and we cut over to Jason's fleshlight sitting on his weird sex altar, and the movie ends. So now, to find out, what are your chances of suffering survivor's guilt? This is where we take a look at our main characters and the death that surrounds them to determine your odds of surviving this movie. We start off our meat bank deposits with the 11 from part 1. We then get Alice going from final girl to beginning girl at deposit number 12, followed by Crazy Ralph going from final girl to beginning girl at deposit number 13. Officer Winslow gets clawed in at deposit number 14, with Scott getting cut down at deposit number 15. Terry is too late to save Scott at deposit number 16, and Mark wheelchair wheelies in at deposit number 17. Jack and Sandra are 2 birds and 1 spear in at deposits 18 and 19, while Vicky finds herself at deposit number 20, and we wrap up our meat bank deposits with Paul, ambiguing in at deposit number 21, into the meat bank. Now let's take a look at our survivors. We've got Ginny, which means that out of a total of 22 characters, only 1 survives, giving you a 4.5% chance of surviving this series so far. However, had you only appeared in part 2, your odds would be out of 11 characters, only 1 survives, giving you a 9.1% chance of surviving this movie, which is better, but not great. Given those odds, how would you clean out Jason's fleshlight? Let me know in the comments below. And if this is your first time on my channel, subscribe and hit that bell so that you don't miss out on the rest of the series, and pop back in next time for a surprise, because we're not covering part 3 yet. Alrighty guys, thanks, and don't die.
You're all doomed. You're all doomed.